we've all been in situations where strategies have been published to great fanfare and, great excitement and stuff, and then the strategy actually just gathers dust on a shelf. And we were determined as an industry that instead this strategy should be dynamic and should be living and should be vibrant. And we committed to doing 6-month reviews, and obviously this is the first of it. The context, I suppose, is that we've got a budget in 2 weeks' time. Right there. Yeah, we have a budget in 2 weeks' time, as everybody knows and everybody's written about ad nauseum, and I'm sure there'll be a lot more articles between now and then. The budget obviously is very relevant for tourism, and a lot in the strategy is if you like, predicated on good government policies and pro-tourism policies. And in that regard, I'm just going to take you through where we are at the moment in terms of a progress update, and I'll be fairly brief. And there's 51 recommendations in the strategy, and you'll be pleased to hear I'm not going to go through each of the 51 because I think we'd all lose the will to live to a certain extent, so I won't do that to you. But what I would like to do is highlight some of the key issues that we think need to be addressed. You all know it's a strategy devised for the industry, by the industry, and of the industry. This is where we are at the moment. 2017 is obviously the last full year, if you like, of tourism numbers. And remember, we talk about tourism as being an export industry. So these are overseas earnings. So 4.9 billion euro was spent by overseas visitors into the country last year. We think that if the right policies and the right pro-tourism initiatives are taken, that can grow by 65% to 8.1 billion euro by 2025. That can lead to 80,000 more jobs. There'll be an increase in visitor numbers of just over 50%. And crucially, and I think it's something that we're keen to stress and kind of convey at every opportunity, tourism is an economic engine for growth, both for the country and also for the regions. So crucially, 23 cents of every euro spent by an overseas tourist goes back into the economy in direct tourism-related taxes. So if overseas visitor revenue grows to something like 8 billion euro, there will be a corresponding increase just shy of 2 billion euro per annum into the exchequer in terms of direct tax revenue from the tourism sector. There were a number of enabling factors. You've got copies of the strategy, or they're certainly behind you anyway. If you recall, there were a number of enabling factors that we highlighted in the strategy that need to happen in order for allow us to hit the numbers as you see there in terms of 2025 targets. So I'll just run through the enabling factors, and then, as Maris mentioned, there's 51 recommendations within the strategy, and I'll take you through some of the kind of more pertinent or relevant ones at the moment. So in terms of the enabling factors, we said that 11,000 more hotel bedrooms need to be developed and open and trading by 2025 if we're to add the capacity in order to reach the numbers in terms of growth that we're talking about. The good news is, according to CBRE, there's 1,468, just shy of 1,500 bedrooms opening in 2018, and there's a further 6,000 on site where bricks are actually being laid. And most new builds are in Dublin, as you'd expect, but there's also activity in Cork and Galway. We've developed a sort of a gauge system. I'm not sure if petrol gauge is the right term, or hybrid, or oxygen gauge, or I'm not sure what gauge it is. But effectively, like any gauge, there's green for success, orange for sort of work in progress, and red for what we think is in retreat or no action has been taken in that regard. So on the hotel bedrooms, we've gone with the green gauge. In terms of the second enabling factor, which was the retention of the competitive tourism tax rate of 9%, that's obviously under intense pressure at the moment. There's a lot of discussion and talk about that. We've put that at an orange. We think it's a key enabling factor if we want tourism to continue to grow and jobs to continue to be created throughout the sector. It's the right tourism VAT rate for the country. It's been good for the exchequer, good for regions, good for jobs, and good for the sector, and it should be maintained. Any increase in it is likely to damage demand, and at a time like this, with Brexit impending, that would be very, very detrimental to the industry. The third enabling factor that we put into the strategy was that good to very good value for money ratings needed to be over 60%. These are ratings that are conducted on an annual basis by Fortune Ireland in terms of exit surveys as tourists leave the country. According to the most recent surveys, this rating is at 52%, so that's a fall of 6%. So it's an orange at the moment. We've got to, if you like, improve our game in that regard, because staying competitive and ensuring the value for money is on offer to the consumer is more important than ever. There's a lot of reasons in there, of course. Business costs have risen, sterling has weakened, making it more expensive for the British consumer here. So there's kind of a lot of reasons for that, but as a sort of on a macro level, we, the industry, and the economy as a whole, needs to make sure that we continue to offer good value for money wherever possible. The fourth one here on this slide is that we advocate that the government needs to invest 60 million per annum in terms of capital investment, in terms of new products of scale and appeal throughout the country. So that's capital investment rather than current investment. The National Development Plan, as you all know, came out earlier this year. It only allocated 30 million per annum to the tourism sector. We think that's far shy of what it needs to be. And if we're talking about building new things of scale and international appeal around the country in strategic points, that envelope of money needs to be increased. And remember, there's 250,000 people at the moment work in this sector, and it's important that we continue to create new things and new experiences. There's 4 more enabling factors. We argued that access into Ireland needs to increase by 40% by 2025. That's air and sea access, predominantly air access. The good news there is, and we've put a green gauge on this, the good news there is that summer air access has continued to grow. It's up 6%, and for the winter season to come, it's estimated to grow by 10%. So lots of great stuff like the new flights from China, Aer Lingus continue to expand into the States. Ryanair particularly active on the German routes. They're all very, very positive for an island like Ireland that depends on air and sea access. Sea access not so positive this particular summer. There's been a lot of operational issues with the likes of the WB8s and so on. But long term, we see very positive growth trends in terms of air and sea access, so we've given that a green gauge at the moment. In terms of current money, and this is part of our pre-budget submission, is that we're arguing that the government needs to restore cuts in tourism budgets, and they really need to be increased by €50 million per annum to allow for increased overseas marketing, provide a Brexit market diversification fund, and increase agency operational budgets. And obviously we await budget 2019 for that. That's in an orange. It's worth stating that the €114 million is what is spent currently by the government on current tourism budgets. €114 million. It's very little when looking at the importance and the size of the sector, and the importance in particular to the region. So we're arguing that €50 million is needed now more than ever if we're to continue to grow and continue to prosper into the future. The 7th enabling factor was that we as an industry have to make sure that we match or exceed the holiday expectations of the tourists when they come here. And the good news is there that latest Vulture Ireland survey actually identified that 99% of respondents state that the holiday matched or exceeded expectations, which is very comforting, if you like, to know that the industry is providing a really good product, and that's obviously a green gauge. And the last sort of enabling factor that we highlighted in the strategy and in terms of our 6-month progress update is the importance of Dublin Airport. And it's not in any way to say that the regional airports or Cork and Shannon or Knock or Kerry are not important. They are particularly important to the regions, but Dublin is and will always be the main gateway into the country. And it's not just for tourism, it's for trade. And there's capacity issues at Dublin Airport. As we all know, it's going to have 30 million passengers this year, and there's issues in terms of congestion, both in terms of airside and landside. The good news is there that the DAA are making significant progress. They've announced that €900 million will be spent on both the new runway and on increasing gates and piers by 30%, which is really, really encouraging. There is an issue with the second runway insofar as construction is underway, but there are planning restrictions, as most of you know, on the number of flights that can depart and land on that second runway, and those planning restrictions really need to be lifted if we're going to maximise that second runway. We have that as an orange at the moment, because if the planning restrictions are lifted and progress continue on that second runway, that should really become a green in 6 months' time when we revisit this. There's 10 pillar themes in the strategy, so it's the A to Z of Irish tourism. I don't know whether many of you have read the whole strategy. I don't blame you if you haven't. There's an executive summary to it, but we tried to be as forensic and as detailed and as thorough as possible. So it's everything from competitiveness to access to capacity to labour skills, to marketing, regionality and seasonality, and there's obviously recommendations with each. So in total there's 51 recommendations, as Mara said at the outset. Where we are at the moment in terms of this first 6-month review of an 8-year plan is that 6 of the recommendations, to our mind, have progressed and have been completed satisfactorily. 32 are what we call work in progress, so attention is needed on those to ensure that the recommendation goes forward rather than slips back. And 13, to our mind, of the recommendations have yet to commence and need to be addressed. And I don't think 6 months into an 8-year roadmap, that is, you nearly expect that the vast majority of the recommendations are work in progress. And what we hope to do is every 6 months to revisit this and see how are those progressing. So has the green gone up? Has the orange stayed the same? Has the red gone up or down? All those sort of things will be particularly relevant and a key metric for the sector as a whole. Each of the themes has 5 or 6 recommendations in it, in total 51 recommendations. I'm not going to take you through all of them now, but I thought I'd pick out some of the relevant or some of the pertinent ones. So in the first theme, which is that of competitiveness, there's a lot there, as you can see. One of the ones I'd just like to point out is the second one, and I should say that there's a little booklet that most of you have, which includes a printed version of this. So by all means, scribble away, but it's online. It'll be on our website, and you also have a printed version with you. But the second recommendation there is all about the importance of competitiveness. And according to the National Competitiveness Council, actually Ireland's competitive position is weakening as business costs are rising, and that's obviously a cause of concern. Thus the red gauge. Again, I'm not flying through these other than just for the purposes of time. We have a Q&A afterwards, we can talk about them. There's a lot in the access issue, which is all about aviation and sea access. There's an awful lot there. That top one is so important, both for the economy, for trade, for tourism, particularly in a Brexit context. That idea of Dublin Airport improving and enhancing its terminal facilities and developing the second runway. And as discussed, that's an orange gauge at the moment. If the planning restrictions are lifted on the second runway, that will be particularly encouraging. The second one there is the importance of continuing the abolition of the airport departure tax. And there's plenty of stuff in there as well. You can see this one here, a liberalised access regime being secured as part of any new EU-UK deal. It's so utterly critical. When the UK leaves the EU, as it's set to do March 29th, the UK obviously leaves the Open Skies Agreement. And I think it was front page of your paper, Mark, yesterday. That has massive consequences for transport and tourism, because literally a UK airline will not have the right or the license to fly into an EU airport such as Dublin. Likewise, an EU airline such as Aer Lingus will not have the right to fly into a UK airline. And there's no WTO rules to fall back on, unlike a lot of other sectors. Aviation is very different. So an alternative to the Open Skies Agreement needs to be put in place before March 29th next year, or otherwise we're going to have a serious issue. And a lot of the industry and the aviation industry, Mike O'Leary in particular, have been very vocal on this, and it's disappointing in many ways that there's not more focus on this in the EU-UK discussions at the moment. The third theme is that of increasing capacity. Again, I'm not going to labour it too much. It's all in the documents in front of you. One of the areas, just to point out, and we mentioned it before, is this need for what we call capital investment in the tourism sector. It's well shy of where it should be at the moment, and that's going to be a handbrake on growth. Exchequer capital investment. This top one here is worth pointing out. We need a published spatial plan outlining how Exchequer investment will be spent in new tourism products of scale and international appeal around the country. We don't have that at the moment. So I mentioned earlier that €300 million had been allocated to the tourism budget for capital investment. We don't have clear line of sight as to how that €300 million will be spent, or what it will be spent on over the next 10 years. That's, I suppose, a task for Fáilte Ireland, who disperse the money. And in Q4 this year, so by the end of the year, Fáilte Ireland are expected to publish a development plan for Irish tourism. So we've put that as an orange gauge because we expect far greater insights into how the capital envelope for tourism will be allocated over the next 10 years. And we're very much of the view that the fewer, bigger, better approach should be taken. We should be investing in products of scale and iconic, if you like, experiences, rather than spreading the jam too thinly. Brexit, we all know the Brexit issue is inside out at this stage, and I suppose the one thing that we can all say is that we don't really know the outcome, but there's a lot of concern here for the tourism sector. And particularly in the context of the upcoming budget, now is not the time to undermine the sector with so much Brexit uncertainty. 39% of all international visitors to Ireland come from Britain. It's our biggest single source market. It's absolutely critical. It's got the best seasonal spread, it's got the best regional spread, and it's so important. And there's a number of things here in the Brexit chapter that we'd be concerned about. The preservation of the common travel area and a soft border on the island of Ireland. You know, we thought it was a given with the backstop agreement, but there seems to be a lot of rowing back from that, which is a major concern of us, for us. Anything that restricts the free movement of people across the island is anathema to tourism and will be very damaging to the sector. The aviation issue I mentioned, and also let's not forget sea access. The idea of customs checks at seaports would be massively damaging to tourism. And particularly ferry passengers who have to come in and out of the ports. And that last one I think is worth highlighting, that there's no resourced Brexit action plan for the tourism sector from the government, which is very, very frustrating for us. So a lot of other sectors, whether it's agri-food or other export industries, have actually got increased funding and increased resources to allow them to mitigate against the negative aspects that Brexit will deliver. And tourism has got nothing to date. There's been no budget increases. So one of the things that we are really arguing about is that it has to be a Brexit mitigation fund for tourism in the upcoming budget. ITIC did a recent study on the cost, if you like, of a hard Brexit of Irish tourism, and we've quantified it quite conservatively, to our mind, as being €260 million in the immediate aftermath, growing to about €500 million. So that's the cost of flight disruption, GB visitor numbers declining, the dangers of a regulatory misalignment between the north and the south. There's an awful lot there that causes concern, and it really needs to be addressed by a beefed up Brexit resourced action plan for tourism. In terms of state support for tourism, there's kind of a lot here, and again, it's all in the documents in front of you. I suppose one of the ones there that you know a lot of people were interested in at the launch of the strategy was when we called for a review of Fáilte Ireland to ensure a sharper definition of role and responsibilities with appropriate levels of funding and resources. That's work in progress. That's the orange gauge, as you can see there. The department is publishing what they call a tourism action plan for the next 2 years. It's due to come out quite shortly, and in that we hope that there will be an assessment of Fáilte Ireland carried out by the department, specifically in the areas of product development, labour skills and training, and research, which are the areas that ITIC pointed out in the strategy Fáilte needed to improve their output on. So we expect in the tourism action plan that there will be an action around that, which will be particularly important to us, to make sure that Fáilte Ireland are appropriately resourced and appropriately funded to respond to the needs of the industry. Regional and seasonal spread, and I'm coming to the end here, you'll be pleased to hear, there's a lot in here again. Just I suppose that top one, we called for the development of a greenway strategy. The good news is, and that's why it's a green gauge, the good news is that the greenway strategy was launched earlier this year, or back in June I think. €53 million being committed over the next 3 years, and there's a commitment to one coast-to-coast greenway, which is very, very encouraging. And it's the type of iconic tourism experience that will appeal to the international market. And another, just to highlight here, and again it's green, and it's one of the actions that Fáilte Ireland have implemented very successfully, is the launch of the brand for the Midlands and Shannon Corridor, Ireland's hidden heartlands. It was launched in March or April. And it's been very well received by the industry, and there's lots of domestic marketing on it at the moment, which is encouraging, and as I understand it, there will be international marketing of that region in the next year. In terms of the marketing, I suppose the one thing that the overseas market, the one thing we do want to highlight is that there is not enough money committed to overseas marketing budgets by the state. So the industry spends a fortune every year, just shy of €100 million every year, so that's the airlines, the hotels, the attractions, the tour operators, spends a lot of money marketing Ireland overseas to encourage people to come here and use their product or service. But equally, Tourism Ireland have to have additional budgets so that Brand Ireland, they're the custodians, if you like, of Brand Ireland, and they need to be able to, if you like, commit more investment to media in key markets. So, for example, we've called for €25 million in increased overseas marketing budgets, and hopefully that will materialise in the upcoming budget. The example I always use is the States. So Tourism Ireland have a budget of about €9 million for the States. There's 25 gateways now from North America with direct flights into Ireland. So that €9 million does not go very far when you're covering that many gateways 12 months a year across all the media channels. And we're going to lose opportunities, and some of those new routes will be unsustainable, if you like, because there won't be awareness of Ireland as a holiday experience and as a destination. The penultimate theme is that of the importance of the labour force for tourism, and tourism, like no other, is struggling at the moment to fill vacancies. It should be said that just shy of 80,000 jobs have been created in the tourism and hospitality sector over the last 7 years, and that's something I think we should be very proud of. About 68% of those jobs are outside of Dublin, so we're a massive regional employer, and we're the biggest indigenous sector by some distance for the country. But there's a lot of issues here in terms of labour force. There is an issue. We feel that there's no, if you like, single accountable state agency that should be responsible for managing and coordinating tourism education, training and skills gaps. We think that should be Fáilte Ireland. There's a statutory responsibility, we think, within the legislation for Fáilte to do that. And we argue that a director of function should be appointed at the agency to reflect the importance of that sector. And of course, Fáilte Ireland's new tourism development plan is due to come out Q4, and we hope that the agency is able to articulate how it looks at this element of tourism within that plan. And the final one, you'll be pleased to hear, is this whole balanced portfolio, making sure that we market diversify. And there's we put in the strategy that the emphasis and focus for accelerated growth really should be North America and mainland Europe. So there's a lot of excitement, justifiably so, about new long-haul markets such as the Chinas of this world. But really, the long-term accelerated growth is going to come from the mature markets where we still have very little market share. So North America and mainland Europe is where we see the growth, and there's significant growth to date in those markets, so we've given that a green gauge. Also within the market diversification is this strategic review of the British market, which is long overdue, and I'm pleased to say that it's close to completion now. Tourism Ireland has set up a review of that market. It's been meeting for the last 6 months or so, and there should be something by the end of the year. So that's a whistle-stop tour. There's a lot in there, and obviously a lot of stuff that we didn't talk about, but that's what the Q&A session is about. If you want to kind of state of the nation, sort of where we're at in terms of the strategy, 13 have yet to progress in our view. 32 are work in progress, so they can either go forward or go backwards by their very nature, so it's important that we keep an eye on those. And 6, if you like, have been completed, which are some of the ones I highlighted. We do intend to come back and do this sort of exercise every 6 months. And I think what will be interesting will be, how that page there changes in terms of which are progressing quicker than others, which are going backwards. But I do think there's an onus, if you like, on the tourism sector as a whole, which is the industry, the agencies, the government, to make sure we're pulling in the one direction. So in terms of the government introducing pro-tourism enabling policies, the agency need to row in behind that and support it, and that will allow the industry to deliver the growth that we've enjoyed over the last few years. And remember, that's growth for both the sector, if you like, in terms of the 20,000 tourism businesses that are in the sector, but crucially, the 1 in 10 people that are employed in tourism and hospitality around the country. There's a lot of jobs and livelihoods that depend on a healthy tourism sector. And just because we've had growth in recent times is not to say that we should take things for granted now, and we should, assume that everything will go, merrily along its way. There needs to be a focus and a commitment to tourism collectively, if we're to hit the growth target that we all hope. So that's it. Ruth, do you want to say anything, or Morris, and then we'll maybe open to any Q&A?
I think you've covered all of the primary points there, and without wishing to labour or drive people's thoughts just in relation to those. The one thing I think that is very apparent is that there's good cohesion within the industry. Everybody is working together, and I suppose that's the one thing that I do find about tourism, in terms of, I sit on the Export Trade Council, and when you look at other industries, who are in the export business, the cohesion, they're almost envious of the interaction that tourism has as an industry, but also with its agencies and with its department. And I suppose this policy is all about ensuring that we keep that cohesion together and that we really work together as an industry, but also being very clear as an industry about how government can continue to enable the success that tourism has enjoyed. You know, we can never forget that we've had the boom to bust in the past, and there's a lot of talk about not wanting to see that again, and we're closer to the next recession than we are from the last one, etc. So tourism really now is about sustainability and making sure that we have managed sustainable growth going into the future. And that's hugely important for the industry, particularly where it's positioned right now. And it is the biggest Indigenous industry in this country. It is deserving of government support. It is absolutely deserving of its 9% VAT rate, of its investment in the longer term in terms of overseas marketing, etc. And I think we've certainly done a lot of work in the first 6 months. And I think just looking at, you know, where we've seen the progress and the dial move into the green, or even more importantly, where we've seen the dial move in those 32 orange areas, that's good progress in a very short period of time. And that's the ability of tourism when we come together as an industry to really make things happen. So on that basis, that's really as much as I'd like to say at this point in time. Maurice?
Well, I mean, I think it's all been well covered, but I suppose the other thing to just to point out is that this document was never intended to be a static document. Strategy is something you have to keep revisiting. So it is only 6 months old. I'm sure the industry itself will review it after 12 months, and we'll see what new, well, obviously at that point in time, we'll know what's happened vis-a-vis Brexit, and that'll have a significant impact one way or another. We'll probably know a lot more about it then. So there may be elements of this plan that will change, but I do think after 6 months the progress has been good. And I think it is important that not just the industry, but that those who are responsible for its growth and development should be measured, and that's what this whole process is about. Because if you measure it, you've got a chance of achieving it. If you don't measure it, and then it can easily and quickly get forgotten about, and it's too important. I think that's the point. Ultimately, tourism is so important now to the economy, we can't afford to let anything slip. So, do you? Anybody wants to ask us any questions?
On Corry Travel Extra, I want to ask you, each of you in turn, from what is the biggest frustration you've seen since the report was initially launched? Where is the first piece of sticking plaster to be applied? What's the running sore that really hasn't been addressed or has to be sorted quickly? Are we running into trouble? Start with you, Maurice, if that's okay.
Well, I suppose it's probably the Brexit point, because even before we finalised the strategy, we were talking about Brexit, talking about its implications. You know, if you said to me, and I was this was a single private sector, and 39% of my customers were under threat, given the size of the British market to us, I would have put very strong mitigations in place. I would have refocused efforts, maybe taken money from other areas to ensure that you shored that up as best you could in terms of mitigation. So I suppose that's, for me, probably the single biggest frustration. And if you had done that, then a bit like some of the other sectors who look at Brexit, maybe a lot more deep thought would have gone into what does a post-Brexit world look like, and what other things would you do to try and mitigate the impacts of it. That really hasn't happened for the tourism sector. It has happened for other sectors. To me, that's the single biggest disappointment.
And I suppose aligned with that, because you know we all see everything through the Brexit lens, particularly as we kind of come to the finishing line as to where we think we might end up in that regard. But the lack of investment in the longer term in overseas marketing, to me, is one of the areas that I feel needs to be more strongly considered, particularly by the Exchequer. You know, tourism is not about, the game is not about today or even next year. It's all about our share of voice and our message in the overseas markets. And if we don't hold on to that share of voice, and right now we're losing share of voice in all of our key markets. And when you look at the level of growth that we have from North America, even the amount of gateways that we now have coming out of that market, it is phenomenal, and it is a market that is, as we can all see, not just producing in the peak season anymore, but the growth that market is now giving us in the off-peak, which is hugely important in terms of seasonality and regionality. So that's business that we need to shore up, and actually in terms of mitigating maybe some of the impact that Brexit's going to have, we need to invest in that market. and we're getting no closer to actually getting additional funding there. So to my mind, in terms of what we're doing to kind of mitigate what the possible outcomes of Brexit will be, we need to be investing now, as by the way are other industries being supported to do so through the Enterprise Ireland, etc. There's additional funding going into international markets, and tourism just isn't getting its share.
I'd echo what Maurice and Ruth have said there. I suppose competitiveness is a kind of recurring issue for all sectors, but tourism no different. And you know, we do have a lot of competitiveness pressures being applied to Irish tourism at the moment, and we saw there the National Competitiveness Council have been quite critical about the slippage in Ireland's competitiveness. And a lot of those are kind of regulated governmental style costs. So I think a real clear eye needs to be put on that. I think one of the frustrations we've had forever, and I think everyone in the room shares it, and the whole idea of this strategy 6 months ago, and us kind of, as Maurice says, making sure that it's a living, dynamic document. One of the frustrations is that tourism is not elevated within the national debate as an economic sector, an economic engine for growth. And what we really want to do is change that narrative. So that's making sure that the government at every single opportunity, when they're talking economics or finance or jobs or whatever, name check and highlight and ensure that tourism is given due acknowledgement and due credit. And that's not just the sector looking for a pat on the back, but this as a sector is just too important to take for granted. I've said it before, it can't be outsourced, it can't be offshored, it's here to stay. There's a hell of a lot more jobs that this sector can provide throughout the country. And it's the only regional employer of note. So there's a lot of talk sometimes, particularly with the VAT and stuff, there's a lot of talk about Dublin hotel rates and all this sort of stuff, which is a tiny component of the tourism family. And if you go to Kerry or Westport or anywhere, you look at Centre Park's investment in Longford, 1,000 permanent jobs, 230 million euro invested in Longford. There's no other sector or industry making that sort of commitment or having that sort of impact around the country than tourism. And I think it's too easy for the government of the day to say, well, tourism is going great, visitor numbers are up, you know, there's more flights than ever into the country, you know, we don't need to worry about it, it'll look after itself. It does need to be nurtured and supported at key junctures, and we're at a key juncture at the moment, particularly with Brexit coming down the track. And you know, what we want to avoid, as Ruth said, is the kind of peaks and troughs. And we're at a peak at the moment. We want to make sure that there's sustainable growth over the next few years, rather than, particularly after Brexit, if it all goes badly, we don't want to fall off a cliff or have a big nosedive in terms of visitor numbers or visitor revenue. And we can do stuff now to mitigate against that. And the industry itself is doing things in terms of the industry itself, the private sector is market diversifying and looking for new markets and stuff. But equally, the state organs need to come in behind that and be appropriately resourced.
Just the budget, short on things. You've quite a shocking list, and I'm sure you'll be quite surprised if you got everything. But I'm just wondering how you would view a budget that would substantially increase investment, say, in product development, training and marketing, and have that fully or partly funded by a rise in VAT.
Well, we don't think they're mutually exclusive, so we would be we would be very much. I mean, it's obviously in the government's gift. I mean, all we can do is put the argument out there. The VAT rate, to our mind, has been very, very successful for the economy as a whole, and particularly for the tourism sector. It should be left alone. Now is not the time to meddle with it. Tourism budgets, remember, have been cut year after year over the last 10 years and are now about 40 million euros shy of where they were in 2008. So we're just arguing that really, you know, an extra 50 million euros should be allocated to tourism, which really only brings us back up to where we should be anyway in the grand scheme of things. One of the things in the strategy that we didn't necessarily highlight there is that there's a 34-to-1 return to the exchequer in terms of investment in tourism, in terms of direct tourism-related taxes. 23 cents of every euro by a tourist, whether it's a domestic tourist or an international tourist, is returned to the exchequer immediately in direct tourism-related taxes. So it's an economic no-brainer to a certain extent, in our mind, for the government to restore tourism budgets. But you know, the taxation side, and if you like, that's Minister for Finance, Pascal Donahue, dilemma at the moment. He's got the taxation and the expenditure side of the house. The taxation side, the government has been good for Irish tourism in terms of taxation. And just because a policy has worked very effectively, to our mind, there's no reason to change it. I mean, can you imagine if a policy had been, a very successful taxation policy had been brought in for the farmers a few years ago and was continuing to be successful and benefiting the regions and the economy and jobs and stuff, you know, it wouldn't be touched. Why tourism should be thought of as any different, I don't know. And remember, if growth continues in tourism, as we all hope it will, there'll be extra income for the exchequer.
So it was an emergency measure introduced 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's no longer temporary.
Yeah, no, it was temporary. It was brought in for 18 months.
Yeah.
If memory serves me right, the corporation tax rate was brought in as a temporary measure whenever it was, 20 years ago, 30 years ago by Rory Quinn or whatever you know. But it worked. It proved job friendly. It benefited the economy as a whole, and it's been kept. And the 9% VAT rate should be thought of as the same rate. And you know, we've been bang on about it quite a lot, but 16 of the 19 Eurozone countries have VAT rates of 10% or less for tourism services. So we're in line with all our competitors. Any increase in that would put us out of line. And also, what it would do, sadly, is the vast majority of tourism businesses out there are small to medium-sized businesses. They would not be able to absorb a VAT increase, so they would have to increase prices. So there'd be price inflation as a result of a government policy, which is the last thing the sector needs.
Some local businesses might well be able to absorb it.
So some of the bigger guys will be able to absorb it, and I think they would acknowledge that.
Yeah.
You know, but the vast majority of the sector are small to medium-sized, either hotels, guest houses, coach companies, and attractions, and margins are tight.
Yeah. Well, two brief comments I'd make about that. I mean, the government clearly does have a policy of regional development, and it is pretty clear from the stats that 65-70% of the job growth in tourism has come outside of Dublin. So that, you know, if you mess with the VAT rate, you're going to mess with that in terms of growth and in terms of the government's regional development plans. The other aspect of this is that I also chair B&B Ireland. We've already contracted prices with inbound tour operators for next year. So if the VAT rate changes, straight away we're into an issue of margin erosion for small and medium and very small operators. So, you know, and clearly all those arguments have been made. One obviously understands at the end of the day, a Minister for Finance has clearly got a lot of competing challenges. So, he and the government have got to balance those issues, along with all we said about Brexit and so on. You can only make the argument, you can make it statistically, which we've done, and you can make it in terms of the importance of the sector now going forward. And then, hopefully we'll get the right outcome. But we'll see.
Just on, we can sort of feel the frustration coming from the industry in relation to tourism industry vis-a-vis other industries. I mean, you know, you haven't had the Brexit fighting fund, you saw it, and you're worried about what's going to happen with the VAT rate. And obviously, the industry has been pushing hard. It's not for a lack of effort from you guys. So clearly, there's something at a political level where tourism has been sold short, in a sense. Are you happy with the share of voice that tourism has around the cabinet table? And does the industry, you think, have full confidence in the Minister for Transport and Tourism?
You start and I'll carry on.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure I get the question right.
It's a loaded question to a certain extent. I hate talking about personalities, you know. We did have the Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar. His first ministerial post was tourism, followed by the current Minister for Finance. We now have Shane Ross, who's obviously outside of sort of the political party apparatus to a certain extent. But the government is a collective. And in our view, the government as a whole, whether that's the minister on his own or the government as a whole, do not pay due attention to tourism and sort of don't, if you like, see the challenges that the sector has in front of it, nor do they see the massive opportunities that are there to be grasped. So
is that the role of the Minister for Tourism, Transport and Tourism to make that case at the cabinet table? I mean, you know, I can imagine that the Minister for Agriculture would be banging on the desk and swinging out the chandeliers if his industry isn't being duly attended to as with other ministers. Isn't that the sole, it's nothing to do with personalities, but isn't that the sole responsibility of that minister to make that argument at cabinet?
hard to argue with that. But I mean, you could make the observation, given you mentioned the Ministry for Agriculture, that the tourism is part of a larger agency, if you like, a larger government department, and yet here we are reminding everybody that tourism is the largest single economic sector in the country. And I think, in a sense, that speaks for itself to your question, which is, does tourism get the weight that it deserves around the cabinet table and in terms of policy development? The answer is no, it doesn't. It has improved over recent times, it has, and the government has made some very good positive policy decisions, but in general terms, no, it hasn't reflected the importance of the industry and the growth prospects and the potential for the industry. I mean, you've heard me banging on about this before, but if you continue to see brand erosion through lack of investment overseas, you will reap, unfortunately, the results of that, which won't be positive.
And it is unfortunate, I suppose, that tourism has almost become a victim of its own success. The industry is doing well, but we have delivered, and more than delivered, on the two policies that the government introduced, be they short-term or otherwise, back in 2011, to actually drive the industry forward, A, to recovery, and B, then on to growth. So, of course, it's disappointing when the government as a whole are not acknowledging the fact that as a key export industry that cannot be offshored, that 80% of the income that comes into the exchequer from tourism is from overseas spend in this country. It is hugely important, and actually, whatever about a minister, but a whole of government need to take a view and an approach to actually getting behind and understanding what tourism is. And to be fair, I think at a local level, there is an acknowledgement and an understanding. I think things like the gathering, have certainly helped in the Irish consciousness to get people to understand the value of tourism. But we need to be doing more of that, and the government need to lead out on it.
Yeah. Is this also, you mentioned there the problem with staff. Is that part of the problem, that the perception is that tourism, that industry is not sexy? It's not something to do. And there's a need for the educators to be educated in what tourism is about.
Correct. There is a degree of work, and quite a degree of work, that needs to be done from an educational perspective, and actually just to get people to acknowledge on the CAO form that tourism is a worthy career path. And there is definitely work to be done there. But tourism offers a very diverse career opportunity for an awful lot of people. I mean, I always think of agriculture, and if you look up and down the Wild Atlantic Way, and the amount of people we have working in tourism who actually are also working in agriculture. But agriculture doesn't sustain them year round or whatever else, and yet we pull a huge amount of those people into our industry and make their lives sustainable at a local level, keep local communities alive, and it's a huge part of what tourism does as well. So it's a multifaceted career opportunity, and I think tourism actually, and we as an industry, and it's something that we've committed to in this strategy, we ourselves need to do a better job on promoting career opportunity within the tourism sector. And that's not just hospitality.
Who's responsible for training for the hospitality industry now? Is it SOLAS? Or is it Fáil Ireland? I mean, my reading of it is that the Fáil Ireland still has the same mandate when the head one is set up, but is withdrawn from training. Yeah. And SOLAS, on the other hand, hasn't really invested an awful lot in it.
Yeah.
And it seems to be caught in a kind of no man's land where there's very little subsidised training going on, and the onus is back on the industry.
Mm-hmm.
Couldn't disagree with anything you just said. We're hopeful that when we see the Fáilte Ireland document, strategy, whatever, I don't know what it's going to be called ultimately, but when we see that, we expect to see some clear policy direction, because obviously that document will have gone through the department, and it will therefore reflect policy, or should be aligned, will be aligned, I'm sure, with policy, and that's a really key part of what we're expecting and hoping to see. I mean, you did see, Frank, that we said that one of the areas that that is red is this whole area of training and development, and that that permeates everything from the fact that a job in tourism is actually a good job, progressive job with strong career opportunities both domestically and internationally, but the whole area of training around that is absolutely vital, and it just isn't there. I mean, I just coming in the car this morning listening to the radio, and I'm talking about the construction industry, and somebody suggesting, I don't know what year he said, but he said a tradesman's going to cost €100 an hour in 5 years' time because we're not training, we're not developing them. And I mean, no idea what the numbers for tourism will be, but you'd have the same issue if you're not training and developing the people. It has to be a break. It has to be a constraint on growth. So, you'd say to yourself, you're looking at it, why don't you develop a strategy that will, back to the numbers we quote here, that will help you deliver to that point?
There seems to be a big gap there.
Yeah, I think that's fair comment.
When we talk about this slide, even to industry people, they're delighted with sort of the ambitious growth targets and stuff, but the one bit that they sort of go, yikes, is the employment numbers. Where on earth will 80,000 more tourism employees come from over the next few years? So there's a big job to be done in terms of changing perception of the industry, I suppose, making tourism more attractive to school leavers, to college goers, to people who are looking for a job, because as Ruth said, it's an attractive industry. There's an awful lot of people in the industry that never leave the industry, and the reason is because it's varied, it's people facing, it's an industry with opportunity, and even the perception is that tourism is a poor employer, or hospitality is a poor employer, and so on. But if you look at the latest CSO numbers, in fact the accommodation and food sector, weekly earnings in the accommodation and food sector grew much faster than any other sector of the economy. But there's a job of work to be done, but there needs to be one single state agency, if you like, coordinating things, managing things, ensuring that if there are gaps in certain areas that they're being dealt with. And at the moment we don't have that to the industry's satisfaction, and we think that should be the role of full challenge.
Just on the employment thing, just looking through this here, you mentioned that you welcomed changes to non-EU worker permit rules, but there's a difficulty around the cap. What is that? What's the problem there?
My understanding is that there's been a relaxation it's particularly for chefs, there's been a relaxation of permits for non-EU workers. So an Indian person, an American or whatever can come here and work within a restaurant as a chef, which is obviously very important, and particularly the restaurant sector would highlight the fact that there's a massive chef shortage and kitchen shortage. The problem is, though, as I understand it, is that that has happened on the one hand, but on the other hand, a cap has been imposed per tourism business, that perhaps they're only allowed 2, I think it is, of those permits. So, for example, if you've got 10 vacancies, you can fill 2 of them by all means with those sort of employees, but that's it. You have to do whatever you can to fill the other 8 gaps. So there needs to be a liberalisation of it and a relaxation of the work permit situation for the hospitality sector as a whole, because a lot of those 80,000 employees will end up coming from overseas, whether it's within the EU or even outside of the EU. They won't all be filled by Irish people.
We saw the publication this week of a wish list effectively from the Westminster government about aviation. They want to reciprocity almost immediately on Brexit. Is that what you would support? Is that a position that you'd support? Or
well,
have you any other observations about aviation post March 29?
No, I mean on the aviation it's very simple. It needs to continue as it currently is. So if you call it reciprocity, if you call it a new bilateral agreement between the EU and UK that covers aviation, whatever you call it, it needs to happen. If you book a flight at the moment for after March next year, it's subject to license. It's like one of those concerts. It's like when we all bought tickets to Garth, what's his name?
Garth Brooks.
Garth Brooks.
You didn't buy a ticket.
I was actually going to go. But it was subject to license. It was subject to license, and of course the license didn't materialise, and we were all left disappointed. Now, nobody wants to see that, but at the moment, such is the sort of political car crash that is happening, particularly in Westminster, there could well be a situation that you fall into the hard Brexit territory, and suddenly the flights have ceased, and then there's a mad scramble to do something about it. But that might take a week, 2 weeks, a month, God knows what, and it will obviously impact on that particular time frame. But also in the run-up to it, people will be very reluctant to make bookings because of the uncertainty. So it's a great frustration for us in ITIC, but also for our aviation partners, whether that's the airports or the airlines, that this hasn't been front and centre of the negotiations, and hopefully it has. Hopefully in dark rooms, behind the scenes, there's people who are ready to sign a memorandum of understanding on aviation post March 29th. But at the moment, we're not getting any certainty in that regard.
Just on the fact of the 11,000 extra bedrooms that looked at by 225, I mean, there's talk that Airbnb, you know, there's a stack of bedrooms going on the street next year, the 3,000 plus bedrooms, right? But the Airbnb will actually impact on that. That's, you know, it's sort of challenging. Have you any views on Airbnb or what you want to see tomorrow?
Well, we work quite closely with CBRE, I'm sure you all know, and they have a very good handle on hotel developments in particular, and they're very bullish and very ambitious for the number of new developments that are happening in Dublin, and it could be 40, 50, 60 hotels over the next few years, and that's very welcome because there was a 10-year period, particularly in Dublin, where there was no new hotels, or very, very few, and you would have lost the likes of the Berkeley Court and lost the likes of the Montrose, you know, so the hotel stock would have fallen at the very time that tourism numbers were climbing, and that's part of the reason why room rates have increased. And finally now, supply is catching up, and there's a lot of new developments in the sector, and in fact CBRE were quick to point out that Galway and Cork are also seeing developments, which is very encouraging. I mean, Airbnb, I mean, it's consumer led, so it's part, if you like, of the tourism community. We would, though, at this stage, like to see an element of regulation of the sector. I think the original idea of Airbnb, of renting a room in your place, or if you're going away for a week, letting your place out and stuff, is great. I think it's a lovely way to experience a city for a particular market. But the sort of commercialization and the commoditization of an awful lot of units around the city as Airbnbs, I don't think is a level playing pitch versus the regulated sectors, which are the hotels, the B&Bs, the guest houses, the caravan and camping sites, all who have to pay VAT for starters, or have health and safety regulations, or apply planning permission, or get planning permission. And I think at this stage, I think an element of regulation to ensure that the level playing field is fair, I think is appropriate.
But then have there been any figures done on the amount of revenue that's been lost to the exchequer? Yeah.
Well, you see, part of the reason, if Airbnb isn't regulated, you don't have line of sight of how big the sector is, or how many units there are, or what the revenue is, or how much people are spending. So that's part of the problem. If there was an element of regulation or licensing or whatever, you'd begin to be able to see how big it is and what the opportunity foregone might be if tourists chose a different product. But that's one of the issues. At the moment, you're relying on Airbnb themselves to actually supply the data, which is all well and good. But being a private company, they're not going to be 100% transparent unless they have to be.
You're not really getting the VAT system sorted out.
Who knows? But I mean, you can see the issues that Airbnb, which is, I agree with Eoghan. I mean, it's been a very useful pressure release valve in terms of growth, and we wouldn't be seeing the continued growth we have seen, particularly I think in the Dublin area, were it not for Airbnb. So that's on the one hand been positive. On the other hand, I mean, there is a very uneven playing pitch. I mean, why should a B&B operator have to abide by all the regulations, and somebody next door who doesn't have a sign up, is doing exactly the same thing, is probably historically in the grey economy or whatever colour you want to call it, and doesn't have to abide by any regulation. And that's before you go anywhere near the contribution or otherwise that it may be making to the housing crisis and the housing shortage. But you've seen what's going on. We've all seen what's happening in other cities, and citizens of the country and of those cities are the ones who ultimately will probably shout loudest and say, there is a place for it, but not to the ubiquitous extent that it seems to exist because it's unregulated. That would be the regulation of that sector is important.
Could I just ask you a little bit about the marketing figure you gave us, 114 million. Does that include the money given by Fáilte Ireland to tourism Ireland?
That's the total sum. That is
that's a contribution to tourism.
That's the taxpayers' allocation to tourism. So that effectively funds Tourism Ireland and Fáilte Ireland.
Yes, but some of the Fáilte Ireland vote is then channeled part channeled through
Yeah.
tourism. And the figure you give us for Tourism Ireland, does that include the Northern Ireland Tourist Board contribution?
No, so the 114 million is the Republic
but
of Ireland.
I think you mentioned 90 million that Tourism Ireland has for promotion.
No, I didn't mean 90. I think I said 9 million
In the US.
Tourism Ireland
America,
have for
yeah.
North America.
That's
Tourism Ireland's 45 million, isn't it?
Yeah.
Tourism Ireland's
Okay.
Yes.
But they get part of their funds through.
Yeah, I think from recollection, Frank, 45 million is Tourism Ireland's budget,
Yeah.
and
Okay.
66% of that, I think, from memory,
It comes from
us, and the balance comes from the UK Exchequer.
Yeah.
Okay, because I really take the point, there's so many new gateways now in America that you just need
Yeah.
additional funds, and it really has,
Yeah.
fallen back. I was interested in your saying that the emphasis in the future should continue to be on maybe your traditional markets, North America and Europe, because the growth potential of, the Middle East, particularly where there's a lot of new gateways now, and China, which seems to be opening up, the growth potential seems to be enormous. And do you think, we should be putting more of our resources in there with an eye to where the growth is likely to come in the future?
Well, we should certainly be investing in those markets without a doubt, because they are emerging markets with a lot of potential, and certainly in terms of volume. But I suppose you've got to fish where the fish are, and when you look at the value of the tourists that Ireland is trying to attract, because it's not just about volume, it is about the revenue that we generate within tourism, and there's a strong focus on that in terms of a lot of the targets that we set is based on revenue, not just volume. And when you look at the North American market and the fact that we have so much access, those visitors A, have an affinity, B, should be easier to catch because Ireland is a better known entity or whatever, certainly as in destination terms. So our focus needs to be, and by the way, the industry along with Tourism Ireland and Fáilte have done strategies. There's a strategy out there for North America, as there is for Germany, to 2025, about how we can grow those markets and what was agreed in terms of targets, etc., and the level of funding that's required to support that. So, the work is done, the roadmaps are there. There's currently one being done in the GB market, so we'll have a roadmap for GB, obviously being done through the Brexit lens as well at the moment. And there has been a strategy done, and it's been done by Tourism Ireland again with the industry. It's now sitting there for nearly 3 years in terms of new and emerging markets. And the level of investment that's required, which was about 6 million was the ask within that strategy that was developed. 6 million in China doesn't get you very far in terms of visibility. And for what the Chinese market know about Ireland, even as a destination, even where we're placed on the map, that's not even going to scratch the surface. So those markets will come, and I think we have to take a longer term view, but they're going to need significant investment. Significant. And until such time as the government agree that that is the sort of, and agree that yes, these are the markets we need to go after, but they need to support it with the level of investment that's required. So the level of investment that we can currently now use in existing markets, where by the way there's lots of potential still to grow those markets. If you're saying where are we going to get better bang for our buck or our euro, it's probably those for the time being, given that we are in an environment where we don't have a big pot of money to spend.
And just on those new and emerging markets, again, the Brexit thing comes into play, because a lot of those new and emerging markets, there's what's called the British-Irish visa scheme, which effectively a consumer in those new and emerging markets buys a visa and then is allowed travel freely between Britain and Ireland on the same trip. So when Brexit happens and Britain leaves the EU, there's implications there. So will you have a visa that will allow you go into an EU country and out of an EU country? So there's a lot of issues there, and again, Brexit pops its head up again. So it's not just a sort of a cost issue that needs to be addressed, but there's a whole lot of different policy permutations that the government needs to be aware of.
Meanwhile, I was in the Strand Hotel in Limerick last week, and they're all talking Chinese. They're all China ready, so they're
yeah, which is great.
The jumbo jets any day.
And there is, by the way, an increase. I mean, just some of the figures that I have done through the incoming tour operators and indeed the visitor attraction sector, with whom I also work with Avia. There's a noticeable increase coming from those markets, and it's nice to see that it's actually spreading outside of the kind of key hubs. Now it's an awful low base, but it is happening, and it will only happen when we are China ready. I mean, there are cultural nuances that we really do need to prepare for, and in fairness to Fáilte, they've led out well with that China ready programme. So it's there now, and we can really ramp it up as we need to. So I mean, that's a positive in itself.
I think you mentioned earlier on about the fragmentation of the industry and how it's a little bit disparate. I think there's a need for an AFA style organisation to take charge of it.
Well, I think if they were IFA salaries, we'd all be we'd all endorse that. No, I mean, ITIC is the representative body for the tourism sector as a whole, and so that's everything from tour operators to attractions to airlines to airports to ferry companies to B&B operators and stuff. There's probably an onus on ITIC itself to increase its profile and reinforce the importance of the sector to the economy. And that's something that we strive for every day, and we get great support from the industry in that regard. We'd love to have the IFA, I suppose, political lobbying machine and powers and stuff, but they developed that over decades.
75 years.
So, we're quite envious of them, as a lot of other lobby representative groups, I'm sure, are envious of the farmers and the policy impacts they can influence. But it's something we strive for.
Mm. Well, they have a huge support, it's European-wide.
Yeah.
And that doesn't exist in many industries. There's no reason, I suppose, why the tourism industries of the 27 European countries couldn't have a big, strong lobby. I know there's
Hotrec.
the European Hotrec.
Yes.
Yeah, but it doesn't seem to be very active.
Yeah.
But I suppose the one big difference between us and the agriculture industry is that we're largely a private sector led entity. So that's why, in fact, the state investment, whether it's current money or capital money, investment in tourism is relatively small vis-a-vis other sectors. And that's because we're largely private sector led. Like 2.5 billion euros being spent by the private sector over the next 2 or 3 years on new hotel developments, on new ferry, the WB Yates, Aer Lingus buying all the aircraft transatlantic, Centre Parks opening in Longford. There's an awful lot of private sector led investment, whereas the farmers, obviously, it's less, if you like, economically viable for them, and they do require that bit more state support and state subvention.
Maybe, Frank, if we changed our name to the FITA, Foreign Investment Tourism Association, we might get more traction.
There was one time when the restaurants were represented by the Irish Restaurants Association, and that had an unfortunate
was Adrian Cummins still in charge of that?
He's split.
So beware on your changing.
Yes, absolutely.
Boris, one of the more succinct observations and the whole cacophony about Brexit, and you said it very, very early on in the process, that the single biggest legacy of Brexit for Ireland would be inflation. Is that still your position as it gets closer, and do you want to expand on that, because it was very wise at the time?
Well, I've no reason to change my view on that. In fact, my worry now is even greater as some of the statistics become more obvious to us. For instance, I heard some statistics from somebody, a significant retailer, that they're expecting if there's a hard Brexit, that tariffs on food that they would directly import on the shelves could amount to 130 million. So when you're into when you're into that type of I guess just pure inflation on the one hand, and then you add to that some of the more obvious challenges, which is food as a sector, for instance, is a just-in-time industry, as is for instance the pharmaceutical industry. It's all about just-in-time. We are, and in fact, the snow for me proved in food particularly how gappy it is if something happens. So if you're going to have, as there will be, tariffs on goods coming out of the United Kingdom in some form or other, you're going to have shortages because we import such a significant amount. So to your question, yes, I think inflation is going to be a big challenge for Ireland Inc. And it is certainly going to act as a brake on growth unless there is some form of lengthy transition from where we are today. But right now it's hard to see that, but then I think in a sense hope springs eternal. Thanks everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thanks for
Rachel.
coming.
Thank you.
Fascinating stuff.